Picture this. You're crawling through the freezing mud of central Gaul. It's pitch black. No moon, no stars, just cold breath and wet earth. You're a messenger, trying to slip out of the fortress unnoticed, trying to reach help before it's too late. The grass ahead looks perfectly flat, a clean stretch, a safe path to freedom. You take a breath, commit to the sprint, and plant your foot, and the ground betrays you. No warning, no sound, just instant collapse. Your leg plunges into a hidden pit, then a sickening crack echoes through the night. You haven't just twisted an ankle, you've stepped into a lily, one of the most evil pieces of Roman engineering ever created. A funnel-shaped hole with a fire-hardened oak stake buried at the bottom, angled and sharpened, designed for one purpose: to shatter the shin bone of anyone foolish enough to run. Pain explodes up your leg, blinding, absolute. You instinctively try to pull free, but the shape of the pit works like a hook. It traps you deeper. Your broken limb wedges tighter. You're helpless. And then, from the darkness 50 yards away, you hear it. Calm, rhythmic, steady. The breathing of a Roman sentry moving through the night. They don't need to chase you. They don't need to duel you. The ground already defeated you. This is the terrifying reality of the siege of Alesia. This is not a battle of swords and shields. It's a slaughter by shovel and starvation. And before we dissect the brutal genius behind these traps, if you enjoy uncovering the darker tactical realities of history, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Do you think engineering wins wars or courage? Because I read every response, and I genuinely want to know where you stand. In 52 BC, Julius Caesar found himself staring at the impossible. He was deep in enemy territory, outnumbered, cut off, and his career, his entire future, was hanging by a thread. Across from him stood Vercingetorix, the King of the Gauls, a leader who had done what no one else had been able to do: unite the tribes. And now he sat at the top of a massive plateau called Alesia, with 80,000 warriors packed behind stone walls. He had the high ground. He had the supplies. He had the numbers. And like every commander before him, he expected Caesar to do what Romans always did: launch a desperate, bloody assault up the slopes. A suicide mission that would end Roman ambition in Gaul forever. But Caesar didn't attack. He stared at that mountain fortress and chose to rewrite the laws of warfare. He ordered his 50,000 legionaries to stop marching and start digging. If he couldn't beat Vercingetorix in a fair fight, he would simply delete the battlefield. The Romans began a construction project of maniacal proportions. They encircled the entire hill with an 11-mile ring of fortifications. But these weren't just walls. They were a complex death zone: trenches, diverted rivers, hidden traps. Caesar wasn't building a fence. He was building a machine. A machine designed to grind the Gallic spirit into dust. From the ramparts, Vercingetorix watched the Roman noose tighten and realized the trap too late. So he played his only remaining card. Before the circle closed completely, he launched his cavalry through a weak point in the lines. Not to fight, to run, to ride to the corners of Gaul and summon a relief army, an overwhelming force meant to crush Caesar from behind. 250,000 men, according to Caesar. Maybe less in reality, but still a tidal wave. Caesar watched them escape and understood exactly what it meant. The clock was ticking. Most commanders would retreat. Caesar did something insane. He ordered his men to build a second wall, facing outward. The Romans were now effectively trapping themselves inside a donut of fortifications. 80,000 desperate warriors inside, a massive relief army coming from outside, and 50,000 Romans in the middle, waiting to be crushed. The hunter had voluntarily become the prey. To understand the magnitude of what's unfolding at Alesia, you have to understand the man on the hill. Vercingetorix wasn't just another tribal warlord. He was an anomaly. Before him, Gaul was chaos, tribes bickering, raiding each other, selling neighbors to Rome for silver. Vercingetorix changed the equation. He was a nobleman of the Arverni tribe, and he possessed a rare combination of charisma and ruthless discipline. He forged unity through blood and iron. Wavering chieftains were punished brutally, ears cut off, eyes gouged out. Because he understood the truth, Rome wasn't coming to negotiate. Rome was coming to erase them. By 52 BC, the Gallic wars had dragged on for 6 brutal years. The Roman machine seemed unstoppable. But just months before Alesia, something unprecedented happened. The machine broke. At Gergovia, another hilltop fortress, Caesar attempted his usual tactic: aggressive assault. He believed the Gauls would shatter under Roman discipline. He was wrong. Vercingetorix used the high ground perfectly. He bottled the Romans, launched counterattacks, and threw the legions into confusion. For the first time, Julius Caesar was beaten. He lost nearly 700 men, including 46 centurions, the backbone of his army. The legions withdrew in disgrace, and that victory sent shockwaves through the ancient world. It proved Caesar was human. It proved Rome could bleed. And most dangerously, it convinced Vercingetorix that he had found the formula to defeat the empire: refuse open battle, retreat to a fortified hill, cut off Roman supplies, and let the legions break themselves against stone. Gergovia became the blueprint, and it also became the trap that doomed him. Because when Caesar pursued him again later that summer, the Gallic king didn't scatter into forests for guerrilla warfare. He looked at the map and chose Alesia, a larger plateau, higher walls, abundant water. He believed he was setting the same trap again, only stronger. But he failed to account for one thing: Caesar learned from his scars. And at Alesia, Caesar didn't bring ladders and rams. He brought surveyors, engineers, stakes, shovels. And that's when Vercingetorix realized something chilling. Caesar wasn't going to fight him. Caesar was going to ignore him and bury him alive. The psychological impact on the Gauls was crushing. These were warriors raised on stories of glory, of single combat, war cries, and heroic charges. Their whole culture revolved around bravery you could see and feel. And now they were forced to stand on the walls and watch Romans dig ditches day after day. No glorious battles to win, no enemies to decapitate, no heroic moments to sing about, just the sound of 50,000 shovels ripping their world apart. Vercingetorix had locked himself in a cage, handed the key to Caesar, and challenged him to a fight. Caesar simply locked the door and walked away to build a wall. And Caesar had all the patience in the world, because his career depended on it. The order moved down the Roman line. 50,000 shields were stacked. 50,000 pila were planted in the earth. And in their place, the legionaries drew something just as iconic as the gladius: the delabra, a heavy pickaxe and mattock, the symbol of Roman power in its rawest form. The tactic was brutal in its simplicity. If you can't kill the enemy with steel, you bury him with dirt, and the speed of what followed was almost inhuman. These men weren't just soldiers. They were the greatest construction crews in the ancient world. Within hours, the valley floor below Alesia was ripped open. The first incision was a massive trench, 20 feet wide, cut directly at the base of the hill. Caesar ordered the walls to be vertical, not sloped. He wanted a sheer drop, a tank trap designed to shatter the legs of any horse that tried to jump it. This trench was the stopping line, a physical barrier to prevent Vercingetorix's cavalry from rushing the Roman workers behind it. Inside Alesia, the mood shifted fast. The mockery died. Alarm took its place. Vercingetorix saw the brown scar of earthworks stretching longer by the hour, and he knew, if Caesar finishes this noose, it's over. So he ordered his cavalry, the elite nobility of the Gauls, to saddle up. They thundered down the slopes, aiming to butcher the legionaries while they were waist-deep in mud. This was the first real test of the siege. Chaos erupted between the hill and the trench line. Roman workers dropped their tools and grabbed shields. They formed tight defensive knots, holding the line while cavalry swarmed around them. But Caesar had anticipated this. He unleashed his own secret weapon, Germanic cavalry. Mercenaries from across the Rhine, savage, aggressive horsemen who fought like predators. They smashed into the Gallic charge with ferocity, and the skirmish turned bloody fast. It was desperate, brutal fighting in the shadow of rising Roman earthworks. When it ended, the Gauls were driven back, leaving their dead in the very ditches the Romans were digging. But that raid revealed a terrifying truth to Vercingetorix. The Roman line was solidifying. Once the main wall was finished, his cavalry, the fastest units he had, would become useless. Worse, they'd be trapped inside, eating food that his infantry desperately needed. So he made the decision that would set everything in motion. Under the cover of a moonless night, before the ring was fully closed, Vercingetorix ordered his entire cavalry force to break out. Thousands of horsemen silently threaded their way through a gap in the unfinished Roman lines. They slipped past sleeping centuries and vanished into the darkness. Their mission was simple: ride. Ride to every tribe in Gaul. Tell them their king is trapped. Tell them to bring every able-bodied man who can hold a spear, and return to crush Caesar. Caesar woke to the news at dawn. He saw the tracks leading away from Alesia and understood immediately. The birds had flown. The clock had started. This was no longer a siege. It was now a race against annihilation, because the relief army wasn't coming to fight a normal battle. They were coming to erase the Romans off the map. Most commanders would panic. They would abandon the siege, retreat, and save their army. Caesar didn't panic. He called for his engineers. He pointed to the empty fields behind his men, the open land away from Alesia. "We've walled them in," he might have said. "Now we must wall them out." And the legions went right back to digging. A second line of fortifications, this time facing outward. A second wall, a second moat, a second kill zone, creating a massive fortified donut. An insanity of engineering with no real parallel in history. The Roman army would live, sleep, and fight in the narrow strip of land between two enemy front lines. And the soldiers groaned, hands blistered, backs aching. But they dug, because they knew when the relief army arrived, those walls would be the only thing standing between them and death. Now, let's walk through the kill zone, because if you were a Gallic warrior trying to attack these Roman lines, you wouldn't just run into a wall. You would have to cross an obstacle course designed to destroy your body and your spirit before you ever saw a Roman face. This was the contravallation, the inner ring facing Vercingetorix, and it remains one of the most brutal examples of military engineering ever created. First came the trenches, not one, but two parallel ditches. each 15 feet wide and just as deep. The inner trench was filled with water diverted from nearby rivers, a stagnant, muddy moat. If you made it across that, then came the rampart. A 12-foot wall of packed earth topped with a palisade. Sharp wooden stakes projected outward to stop climbers, and every 80 feet, a wooden tower rose over you, 3 stories high, manned by archers and scorpion artillery crews. But the true genius and cruelty was what sat in front of the trenches. Because Caesar knew he was outnumbered, he couldn't man every inch of the wall at every moment. So he built something horrifying. He built automated defenses. He turned the landscape itself into a weapon. Closest to the wall were the Scipi, massive tree trunks buried deep with sharpened branches jutting upward, interlaced like a forest of antlers. They tangled formations and pinned attackers in place while Roman archers fired down at leisure. Then came the field of lilies, 8 rows of funnel pits arranged in a checkerboard pattern, each hiding a hardened stake, waiting to snap bones like dry twigs. And beyond the lilies, the most insidious of all, the stimuli. Simple blocks of wood with iron hooks driven into them, buried underground with only the hook barely visible. Ancient landmines. You couldn't see them. You stepped on one and it drove into your foot, and when you pulled away, the barb tore through nerves and muscle. A man crippled by a stimulus wasn't dead. He was screaming, writhing, blocking the path behind him, a weapon against morale. Caesar's men planted thousands. They created a no-man's land nearly 400 yards wide. This wasn't war. This was a meat grinder. And by the time the second wall, the circumvallation facing outward, was completed, the Romans had built nearly 25 miles of fortifications. They had enclosed themselves inside a fortress of their own making. The machine was built. The traps were set. Now all it needed was to be fed. While the inner wall suffocated Vercingetorix, a new threat was swelling beyond the horizon. The Gallic cavalry had done their job. The call to arms spread like wildfire through the forests, villages, and hill forts of Gaul. From the misty coasts of Armorica to the mountains of the Arverni, tribes that had hated each other for generations suddenly set aside their blood feuds for one reason: crush the Roman invader. A massive relief army. Caesar estimated 250,000 men. Modern historians often lower that number, but even the conservative estimates are staggering. And now that force was marching toward Alesia. Caesar was racing against physics. He had to finish the outer wall before the wave hit. This outer ring, the circumvallation, wasn't a prison. It was a fortress. 14 miles long, wrapping around the entire Roman operation like an iron collar. The legionaries were now living in a narrow strip of land between 2 hostile perimeters. Imagine a long, fortified hallway circling a mountain. Inside that hallway lived 50,000 men, thousands of horses, and all their supplies. They were the besiegers, but they were also the besieged. And the psychological strain was unlike anything most armies ever faced. Normally, a besieging force camps comfortably in open countryside, raids farms, sleeps with room to breathe. But here, the Romans were trapped. They could only forage in a shrinking territory. Every foraging party was a gamble. Stray too far, and Gallic scouts would pick you off. Stay too close, and you'd starve. So Caesar ordered the same deadly jewelry installed on the outer line. Trenches, Scipi, lilies, stimuli. A 2-front war, with the fronts pressed back to back. A Roman on the wall could look left and see Vercingetorix's starving men inside Alesia, then look right and see dust rising from the approaching relief army. Even Vercingetorix, watching from his high perch, could see the second wall rising. it must have been bitterly reassuring. On one hand, it meant help was coming. Why else would Caesar build outward defenses? But on the other hand, it meant the relief army wouldn't be marching into a normal battle. They'd be marching into a meat grinder. Inside Alesia, time became the true enemy. Vercingetorix had calculated supplies for 30 days. 30 days passed. No relief army. The grain silos emptied. The cattle were slaughtered. Panic began replacing discipline. The Gallic council met in a grim atmosphere. Some chieftains whispered surrender. Others proposed solutions too horrific to say out loud. One noble, Critognatus, suggested cannibalism, eating the old and weak to preserve the warriors. Vercingetorix rejected cannibalism, but his alternative was only marginally less brutal. He decided to purge the city of useless mouths, the elderly, the sick, the women, the children. Most tragically, the Mandubi, the local tribe that owned this town, the people who had opened their gates to Vercingetorix and welcomed his army. Now, in return, they were being evicted from their own homes. The gates of Alesia creaked open. Thousands of civilians shuffled out, carrying scraps of possessions. They moved downhill toward the Roman lines, weeping, but holding a flicker of hope. They believed Caesar, representative of civilized Rome, might take pity. Maybe he'd enslave them. A terrible fate, but better than starvation. At least he'd let them pass into the countryside. They reached the Roman trenches and looked up at the legionaries. They begged for bread. They begged for slavery. Caesar looked down and made an icy decision. He wasn't running a charity. He was running a siege. Every mouth he fed meant fewer rations for his soldiers. And if he let them pass, he'd lose psychological leverage over Vercingetorix. He wanted the Gallic king to watch his own people suffer. Caesar ordered the gates barred. The Mandubi turned back toward Alesia, screaming to be let in. But Vercingetorix refused to open the gates. He couldn't afford to feed them. And so, the Mandubi were trapped in no man's land. Between two armies, between two walls, between two kinds of death. For days they wandered the killing fields. They ate grass. They gnawed bark and leather. Wives held starving infants toward the walls, pleading with husbands inside the city, and Romans outside. Both sides watched. The Roman legionaries, hardened men who'd seen everything, stood guard and listened to the slow death of thousands of innocents only yards away. The Gauls on the walls watched their families wither in mud. This wasn't war anymore. It was psychological torture. And by the time the relief army finally arrived, the cries from the ditch had mostly stopped. The Mandubi were gone, reduced to corpses scattered across Caesar's obstacle course. A gruesome prelude. A reminder that at Alesia, honor had been stripped away. Only survival remained. Then the horizon came alive. The standards of the relief army appeared like a moving forest. Cavalry first, then an ocean of infantry. The outer wall was about to be tested. Inside Alesia, starving warriors heard the commotion and grabbed weapons with shaking hands. The waiting was over. The apocalypse had arrived. The relief force, commanded by leaders like Commius and backed by Vercingetorix's allies, spilled into the plain like a landslide. Caesar claimed 250,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Even if those numbers are inflated, the Romans still faced a force 4 times their size. The ground vibrated. War cries erupted. Shields slammed. Carnacs war trumpets blared. Screams of metal that drowned out Roman orders. And then Vercingetorix ordered the gates thrown open. His men didn't march out. They poured out. famine-fueled rage carrying ladders, hurdles, and desperation. For a Roman on the wall, the nightmare became reality. Hurl a pilum at the relief army, then spin 180 degrees, draw your gladius, and hack at Gauls climbing up from the inside. The space between the two walls became a pressure cooker. The first assault tested the engineering. The relief army charged into the kill zone, and the results were horrific. Horses impaled themselves on hidden stakes. Waves of men fell into lilies, bones snapping, only to be trampled by those behind them. Roman scorpions punched holes through dense Gallic ranks, but the Gauls had numbers. They tossed brush into trenches to form bridges. They dumped earth over spikes. They paved a road with their equipment and their dead. Caesar stood at a vantage point, not fighting, conducting, listening for trumpets, watching for signals, shifting cohorts like chess pieces. Wherever the line buckled, reserves moved in. Night brought no relief. Under darkness, a second wave surged forward with grappling hooks and siege engines. Romans hurled pila blindly at the roar of bodies. Screams echoed through the valley. By morning, the assaults were repelled, but the engineering advantage was fading. Tens of thousands of bodies clogged the traps. The kill zone was becoming a carpet of corpses. The Gauls realized brute force wouldn't break the wall, so they scouted, and they found the flaw. To the north, near a steep hill called Mount Rhea, the Roman lines couldn't fully enclose the terrain. The wall there sat on lower ground, vulnerable, guarded by only 2 legions. So the relief army didn't send raiders. They sent 60,000 of their best men. A sledgehammer aimed at a single crack. They moved at night, hid behind the hill, and waited for high noon to unleash the death blow. At noon, the hillside erupted. 60,000 Gauls charged down, smashing into the weak point. At the same moment, Vercingetorix launched a massive assault from inside against that same section. The Romans were caught in a vice. The line began to break, and then Caesar played his final card. He didn't send another general. He went himself. He grabbed the last reserves, called for his Germanic cavalry, and donned his paludamentum, the scarlet general's cloak. In the dust and gray chaos of battle, that bright red was a beacon. Caesar rode directly into the melee. The effect was electric. Exhausted legionaries saw their commander fighting beside them. Retreat became impossible. The line stiffened. Swords came out. Close quarters slaughter began. But courage alone couldn't stop 60,000 men. The Gauls pushed forward, step by bloody step, and that's when the ghost in the machine struck. Caesar's Germanic cavalry had circled wide around the hill and slammed into the rear of the relief army. Panic spread like fire. The Gauls broke. Momentum flipped in an instant. Romans surged forward. The besiegers became the surrounded. The slaughter that followed was mechanical. The relief army didn't retreat. It dissolved. Cut down by cavalry, trampled by comrades fleeing into forests. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched his last hope shatter. The scarlet cloak, the collapsing lines, the survivors hunted down. The battle noise faded, replaced by groans and Roman cheers. The relief army was gone, and Vercingetorix was alone. The next morning, the plain outside Alesia was empty. No army, no hope, no food. Vercingetorix convened his council one last time. He told them he fought not for personal gain, but for the liberty of Gaul. He acknowledged they must yield to fortune. Then he offered them a choice: kill him to appease Rome, or hand him over alive. They chose the latter. Envoys went to Caesar. Caesar's terms were cold and brief. Hand over your weapons. Bring out your leaders. He sat in his tribunal seat like a judge, not an equal. Then the gates of Alesia opened. Vercingetorix rode out alone, not as a beggar, as a king. Finest armor gleaming, horse groomed perfectly. He approached Caesar's seat. According to later writers, he rode a circle around Caesar, a final, silent display of pride. Then he dismounted, unbuckled his sword, stripped off his armor piece by piece, and tossed it at Caesar's feet. Then he sat in the dirt, silent. Caesar didn't speak, didn't offer a hand. He simply signaled his guards. Vercingetorix was seized, chained like a thief, and dragged away. Years later, Caesar paraded him through Rome, and when the parade ended, the king was taken to a dungeon. No trial, no speeches. A rope tightened around his neck. With one brutal twist, the resistance of Gaul was strangled. And yet, the legacy didn't die with him. Caesar meant to erase Vercingetorix, but by writing about him to glorify his own victory, he accidentally immortalized him. Alesia reshaped the map of Europe. Gaul became a Roman province. Celtic culture slowly absorbed into the empire, forming the Gallo-Roman world that would eventually give birth to modern France. Today, at Alesia, a towering statue of Vercingetorix stands, erected by Napoleon III, no longer a barbarian rebel, but the first national hero of France. And Caesar? Alesia was his masterpiece. It proved Roman engineering and ruthless pragmatism could overcome any odds. It gave him power, wealth, and the loyalty of his legions, enough to overthrow the Republic. But there's grim irony here. 2 years after strangling Vercingetorix, Caesar himself would be butchered by his own friends on the Senate floor. Conqueror and conquered, both consumed by the grinder of history. So when we look back at the concentric walls of Alesia, the hidden traps, the starving civilians, we're left with a question that doesn't feel comfortable. We marvel at Rome's roads and aqueducts, but Alesia reminds us civilization is often built on bones. Before you go, I want you to answer this in the comments. Was Vercingetorix a hero who doomed his people by fighting a war he couldn't win? Or a martyr who proved freedom is worth any price? I'll be down there debating with you. If you found value in this deep dive, subscribe and ring the bell. We've got many more lost stories to uncover. Until then, remember, history isn't just names and dates. It's the study of survival,